I'm tasked with this session for A, keeping us on schedule, and B, relaying a very small fraction of the excellent questions we're going to get. And as usual, submit them to the chat, the link in the chat box. So next up, Aneesh will be presenting, quote, "Do ESG funds make stakeholder-friendly investments?" He's co-authored this paper with Shiva Rajagopal. Aneesh, you have 20 minutes before Gaizka's discussion, so please take it away.
Sounds good. And let me just get my screen shared really quick. All right, slides moving correctly? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I just want to start by first thanking the organizers, thanking the editors for giving us the chance to present this paper here. We're really excited to sort of showcase it at the RAST conference, and I'm looking forward to both Gaizka's feedback and the questions we'll get from the chat, and we'll sort of work on those later on. And so let me get right into it. And I think this is a case where the paper's title kind of gives away what we're up to and what we're trying to do in this paper. So the big picture question we're really after here is quite simply, we've seen a proliferation of ESG investing in the last few years, the last decade, roughly speaking. And a lot of these funds kind of make claims of investing in firms that somehow treat stakeholders better, right? You can have funds that pick firms that have better labor practices, environmental practices, consumer protection, whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of investment products out there, many of which target retail investors, that claim to make socially responsible investments, right? And our big picture question is really just asking, well, are these claims of social responsibility by funds, are they really backed up by the data? And I think there are a number of reasons we can do this, and given the theme of the conference, maybe I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. But as I just mentioned, there's been a huge growth in ESG-oriented investing in the past few years. I can show you something in the next slide about some news articles about how there's more, records keep being shattered on the extent of ESG investing. So this isn't going away, but it's something where we want to understand well, and especially as we see more and more people start to invest for the first time. Maybe a selfish way to put this, given who I am, is, well, are millennials like me actually getting what we pay for if we take these things into consideration? And so just really quickly, how do we do this? I'll touch on this in a lot more detail later on. What we're going to do is we're going to analyze track records of portfolio firms that are held by sort of self-labeled ESG funds. And we're going to compare them against funds held by the same financial institutions or asset managers or fund families in the same years. And I'll explain the reasons for this design choice in just a little bit. But I first want to start by just motivating a little more, why should we care? And well, quite frankly, one reason we should care is that ESG is sort of now found in imperial space in the investing environment. So it's not going away. So it's something where we need to understand, given that there's more and more pressure to put, retirement funds or for retail investors to make decisions consistent with some notion of values. You have these products springing up to offer funds and offer investment products that are supposed to be consistent with what the end user, retail investors like ourselves, institutions responsible for managing things like retirement funds. You have the ESG investing has just kind of exploded in response to this demand. But one thing that's historically been the case is that there hasn't necessarily been a lot of verification of what these funds are actually up to. And potentially in response to this kind of lack of historical verification, we've seen a recent tidal wave of skepticism about ESG investing, right? So just this past March, the SEC put in place what's called a climate and I believe ESG task force, where the whole goal of the task force was to try to understand, okay, which funds are actually doing what they say they are and which funds are not. And this kind of coincided with a number of former high-ranking sustainability executives. So a couple of well-known examples are BlackRock's former chief of sustainability, Deutsche Bank's former chief of sustainability, kind of coming forward and saying, we offered these ESG products and they didn't really do what we told the public they did. So our big picture goal in this paper is just to understand, well, are ESG funds actually offering the end user what they say they are? Are they actually giving retail investors like myself, for example, a venue to which they express their non-financial preferences in their investment decisions? And I'll talk about how we intend to measure all of this in just a moment. But before I get too far, I think it would be helpful to maybe just give a brief definition of what we mean by ESG investing. And this is something that is likely not new, but it might help understand where we are coming from in this paper. So we view ESG investing as broadly referring to any attempt to invest in firms that abide by some degree of moral principles, right? So you pick firms that say they treat the environment better. You pick firms that claim to be socially conscious. You pick firms that you think have good governance. These are the E, S, and G. Now, of course, any given end user's specific preferences might differ a little bit in what they care about the most, but there are also products targeted at these users. But by and large, most ESG products don't really specialize or focus. They tend to say we pick firms that are on average better in all of these dimensions, right? That's the claim, and we're testing whether that claim is largely speaking held up by the data. So what do we mean, and how do these funds actually go about making their investment decisions? That's something that's important to understand before we move further into our design. So ESG funds typically claim to invest in one of two ways. One is what's called exclusionary screening, which is kind of the more traditional old school way of going about ESG investing, which is that we say there are certain industries that are just bad, right? And this can be, the definition of bad can vary a little bit, but largely this includes things like alcohol, tobacco, firearms, oil and gas, right? There's a certain set of industries, you might hear them called sin stocks or sin industries, that sometimes will get excluded, and then the funds in question will just kind of make decisions on the remaining choice set as if, purely with financial considerations in mind. Now, what's becoming increasingly popular, however, is instead of exclusionary screening, to have inclusionary screening, right? The idea that these funds, what is the value they really provide to the end user? And the value that they claim they provide is to say, well, we're going to use a lot of data. We're going to use some sort of ESG metrics, which are often vendor-supplied ESG scores. I'll turn to this point later on as to why this could be an issue. But we're going to rely on some level of measurement of a firm's ESG practices in order to pick specific stocks. And this is how many, if not most, of the funds in our sample operate. Right. So the idea is that they rely on some sort of ESG data. They may tell you what, they may not. And this data tends to be scores. And actually, one thing that the SEC specifically called out in an April press release was ESG funds over-reliance on ESG scores. And I'll talk about, so we actually have a test on that later on, and I'll talk about why this over-reliance on scores could potentially be an issue in what the end users, such as ourselves, are getting. So I should say first a little more about what we actually do. And so in order to try to figure out if ESG funds are doing largely what they say they are, we're going to assess the performance of self-labeled. Again, these are self-labeled. They themselves offer themselves up as ESG funds. And we're going to really compare them to their peer funds along several different dimensions, some of which I'll get into in more detail than others. And then, of course, we've run some other stuff that hasn't made it into this draft, but I'm happy to talk about if there are sort of questions about why we did or didn't do certain things. But our main measure of firm quality, right? Our main measure of, are these funds picking firms that actually treat stakeholders well, is understanding whether these firms actually comply with social and environmental laws. And the idea behind this is pretty simple. The idea behind this is simply that it's hard for a firm, in our view, to say that, hey, we're a good firm, we're ethical, when at the same time you have employees who are getting robbed through wage theft, you have a firm taking decisions not to invest in workplace safety and putting its workers' lives at risk. You have firms deciding that pollution is optimal instead of just cleaning up a little bit, right? To us, it's kind of hard to view these firms as high ESG when they've demonstrated a history of engaging in these kinds of practices. And another benefit I should also mention, we're accountants, we tend to think about, when we think about misconduct, we often think about financial fraud, and then of course you get some measurement issues, right? Where financial fraud is rare, it's hard to observe, and so you get a lot of noise. I'm not saying those are completely gone from our setting, but one really nice econometric thing for our setting is that most of the violations we look at are issued by agencies that use what I call an outcome-based approach, not an intent-based approach, which means that they have, they issue way more enforcement actions, but with smaller penalties. right? So for example, the SEC conducts maybe 1,000 investigations a year, if that. OSHA and the Wage and Hour Division conduct 20 to 30, or sometimes even 40,000, right? So we just see it's just much less likely that we'd miss a big issue if it's actually there. And of course, we look at some other metrics as well. We look at carbon emissions, we look at corporate governance. Now, I said in the beginning that one of the key innovations or one of the key features of our research design was that we compare ESG funds to non-ESG funds issued by the same asset manager in the same year, or maybe stated differently, they're in the same fund family in the same year, however you want to call it. Now, we do this for two reasons. One is, of course, that this ensures that our results are not driven by broader asset manager level factors. So we're not so much comparing asset manager A against asset manager B. We're trying to say, okay, within a given asset manager, do your ESG funds actually perform better than your own non-ESG funds? And we also do this because we think this actually kind of better mimics how investors actually behave, right? So if you think about your own experiences with retail investing, the way a lot of us, maybe not all of us, but the way a lot of us tend to invest is we first put our money in a brokerage. Then we log into our brokerage account and we look for some funds. And so the relevant choice set there is going to be the ESG funds offered by that brokerage compared against the non-ESG funds offered by that same brokerage. And that it's really that which we're trying to capture in making this decision. Now, to formalize this a little bit, what do we actually do? We construct a weighted average measure of the relevant outcome variable, right? So this will be things like violations, this will be carbon emissions, this will be governance measures. We've tried some other stuff too. And we're just going to construct a weighted average measure of, where portfolio weights are driven by the total value of the given mutual funds holdings in the underlying stock, right? So the violation data, right? The ultimate corporate conduct data is at the firm level. And we are constructing weighted fund level averages on the basis of the fund's portfolio. And then we're just gonna estimate. So kind of using an asset manager by year fixed effect, right? So that the comparisons are within asset manager within year. We're just gonna estimate whether ESG funds perform any differently or better or worse along the dimensions we consider. So how do we identify ESG funds? This is probably the hardest part. And luckily for us, Morningstar each year publishes what's called a report called the Sustainable Funds US Landscape. And what this is a comprehensive list of self-identified, and that part's important, right? Because this isn't Morningstar saying, we think this fund is ESG and that one isn't. This is a list of self-identified ESG funds. All Morningstar is doing is saying, we're looking at all the prospectuses, we're looking at all of the disclosures, and we're just trying to figure out which ones call themselves ESG, right? In many cases, this is pretty straightforward, because as you can see, for example, this one calls itself socially responsive right in the title, or sustainable, right? So this is just a comprehensive list of self-identified ESG funds, funds that are calling themselves good. We're going to get data on these funds and their holdings. We can map that into our underlying firm level data, and that then allows us to run all of our tests. And to measure ENS records, to measure compliance history, we're going to rely on a database that I've used in many other studies and that many of you in the audience have probably also used as well, called Violation Tracker. And what this is it's a comprehensive repository of firms' corporate conduct histories, right? So we can see all of their environmental violations in the past 20 years, all of their labor violations, the types of labor violations, and so on. We can see basically every bad thing that
it's more about
and I think somebody might have come unmuted, but and we can also see, and we also are going to draw upon some other data as well. So we'll take carbon emissions from true cost, and then for corporate governance, we kind of use the usual suspects. So what do we actually find? And so to answer our sort of first big picture question, whether ESG funds seem to pick better stocks along these dimensions, the answer is a resounding no. We find that ESG funds actually pick stocks that have worse labor records, right? They're screwing over their workers. They have worse environmental records, and also, weekly higher carbon emissions. Now, one thing that we thought was kind of interesting, and I'll dive into why this is a little later on, is that ESG funds also pick firms with better disclosure about emissions, right? So what happens is they pick firms that have worse carbon emissions. and yet are sort of more forthcoming in their annual reports or sustainability reports in their discussions about emissions, right? So they pick firms on the basis of emissions disclosure rather than actual emissions seeming. And that we're going to investigate that why that might be in just a moment. But before I get there, I just want to briefly cover the third, ES and G. Our paper focuses more on the ENS. We do have some tests related to governance where we find mixed evidence, right? So ESG funds, portfolio firms do have lower normal compensation, but also tend to pick firms with less independent boards. And one simple reason that this might be is it's consistent with ESG funds over-investing in tech relative to the broader set of investment products and going short on oil. And if you think about a lot of the tech firms that have gotten big and popular in the past 20 years, you think about these firms that have enormous power concentrated in these founder CEOs. And so these guys have just so much in terms of shareholdings that they don't need to pay themselves too much. Right. And we actually find that when we rerun our tests on an entropy balanced sample where we explicitly control for the percentage of tech holdings, the G results disappear. The other results still come through, but this result disappears if we hold the percentage of tech holdings fixed between ESG and non-ESG funds. Now, I've got a couple minutes left, so I want to highlight a couple of other things that I thought were kind of important. So to come back to the result I just discussed, that ESG funds pick portfolio firms with worse emissions, but better disclosure about emissions. Why might this be? And one channel that we suspect might be driving this is ESG scores. Now, there's prior evidence, so we didn't, we aren't the first ones to look at ESG scores in this way, but there's prior work out there showing that ESG scores tend to over-rely on disclosures about ESG, right? Voluntary information provided by firms, but that they don't really seem to pay attention to the underlying content of these disclosures. So if you're a firm and you say, we have really, truly high and terrible carbon emissions, but we're trying really hard and in 30 years we'll fix it. That'll get you a higher ESG score. That seems a little weird to us, but that seems to be what's actually happening. And this may not be true across all vendors. The usual caveat applies. We tried multiple vendors, we didn't try them all. But at least for for KLD, for Asset 4, some of the most common vendors that you'd encounter both in academia and in practice, we find that ESG scores might be driving this. And so consistent with this, we find that ESG funds do pick portfolio firms with higher average ESG scores, right? So even though they're picking the firms that are mistreating their employees more often, mistreating the environment more often, they are picking firms that have better ESG scores. And this is kind of a nice sanity check for us because we know practically, but that this is something that some, if not all of them, will do. Now, the kicker here is that if you then go directly to the raw scores, you find that these ESG scores seem to be, again, confirming prior work, correlated with voluntary disclosure about ESG, right? So it's correlated with the existence of emissions disclosure. It's correlated with the metric that picks up sort of just the overall quantity of ESG information disclosed. But there's no relation between ESG scores and what firms are actually up to, right? There's no correlation between ESG scores and labor track records, environmental violations, there's minimal correlation with emissions, right? And we think this is what's driving a lot of our results, this kind of over-reliance by funds on ESG scores that, again, seem to soak up voluntary disclosure and maybe not that much else. And so then this leads to a couple of bigger picture questions. Well, why would you even create ESG funds if they're not doing what they say they are? And for this, I'm going to rely on a Wall Street Journal article, which gives a short and cynical answer, which is that you can charge more. And we find evidence consistent with this. ESG funds charge on average higher management fees. And despite this, they seem to offer lower financial returns. So it's not clear where you come out ahead unless you are the bank or the asset manager offering the fund and collecting the fees. But it's not clear where, as the end user, someone like me would come out ahead. And then, of course, well, there's another explanation that we can't fully rule out, but we can try, which is that maybe ESG fund managers are just picking firms that they expect to improve, right? So maybe the argument is that they're intentionally investing in the bad guys, right? And that's going to make them look bad under our tests, but they're doing so that they can actually come in, intervene, and fix the mess. But we look at this and we don't find any evidence consistent with this story either, right? As ESG fund presence in a firm increases, nothing happens. Right, so we don't find any evidence in support of influence awards. Now, of course, we're not saying that this can't happen, just that on the broad sample of ESG funds, in the broader, if you look at the broader universe of ESG investing, this doesn't seem to happen, right? So there may be cases which in one, it could be fruitful for concurrent and future research to understand where this works, but on average, it doesn't seem to do much. Now, I know I'm just about out of time, so let me just quickly wrap up. What do we find? Why do we care? We don't find much evidence that ESG funds or funds that label themselves as socially responsible or ESG, CSR, whatever you want to call it. We don't find much evidence that these funds are doing what they say they are. And in fact, we find that these funds are picking firms, again, relative to other funds offered in the same fund family at the same time. We find that these funds are actually picking firms with worse labor and environmental records. And we find that, and we argue that this is probably at least in part driven by an over-reliance on commercial ESG scores, and in turn, an over-reliance on firms' voluntary proclamations of social good, but not the ones that are actually backed up by hard data. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm just about out of time, and thank you again for comments, questions, and I look forward to guys' discussion.
All right, thank you, Aneesh, for your presentation. Only 1 minute over, so I'll hand it off to Gaizka for your discussion, and then 10 minutes for questions after a 15-minute discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew. I guess you can hear me well. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. Well, I'm just going to illustrate some of the things that Aneesh just said. ESG investing is definitely on the rise. I mean, here you have some data. It's already in the trillions. More than 4,000 PRI signatories with trillions under management. Hundreds of ETFs and open-end funds. There's more and more to this. So the question is this money going where it's supposed to be going, right? And a big concern along these lines in terms of the efficient allocation of all this money is greenwashing by investment companies, right? Do we have any anecdotal evidence of it? Yes, I think that there is some anecdotal evidence. You have one example on the screen. Regulators seem to be concerned about it, suggesting that it's just not anecdotal. This is a piece of news that Aneesh just said, so I'm not gonna comment on it. There are important regulatory responses. Here you have two examples, one from Europe, another one from the US. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This is on sustainability-related disclosures in the financial services sector. The SEC just created a climate and ESG task force to proactively identify misconduct related to ESG issues. So important topic, timely topic, great research topic. So against this background, the takeaway from this paper, what the authors conclude after, I would say, pretty thorough and competent empirical analysis, is that these results undermine ESG funds' claims that they are picking responsible stocks for inclusion and suggest substantial greenwashing part of ESG funds. So I'm going to focus on, let's say, two discussion points in this discussion. The first one would be, to which extent do the empirical results reflect opportunism? The second, does the paper inform the debate on how to deal with greenwashing? All right, so on the first point, do the results reflect opportunism? Here is a summary of the results. This might not do justice to the paper because they do a lot of work. So, but I tried to sort of like, summarize all the results on one slide. Red means concern, green means no concern. Intensity means, let's say, more robust, less intense. Color means less robust empirically. So, I mean, my takeaway from this overall is that it's actually not that red. There's definitely evidence that ESG funds tend to invest in firms with more labor violations, which is a little bit disturbing. But there is also evidence they found that they tend to invest in firms with more emissions. But we are talking about indirect emissions, right? Not direct emissions, Scope 1 emissions. And there is also some green over there, right? So, I mean, they tend to invest more on firms with better ESG ratings and better ESG disclosure. Now, the question is whether these ESG ratings actually reflect ESG performance, right? There has been some research about this. So let me show you this a recent paper using proprietary data. And this figure illustrates basically the finding of the paper, right? So there is some correlation among ratings, but there is also quite a divergence. Divergence that comes from scope and measurement, not that much from weighting. These are the pair correlations among ratings, at least as documented in that paper. So the average correlation, as you can see, is 54%. Okay? High, low, well, if you compare with credit ratings, definitely low, right? The correlations among credit ratings are close to 100%. And also another thing to take into account here is that there are many ratings out there, not just the ones I just showed. And this is a continuously evolving industry. There has been a lot of M&As and a lot of consolidation, as you can see illustrated in that figure. Now, what are the issues, criticisms on ESG ratings? Well, the usual one-size-fits-all kind of criticism that you are using the same criteria for all firms, and you know, there could be some idiosyncrasies that are not picked up here. Another criticism is that these ESG ratings are based on voluntary, largely unaudited, incomplete, and hard to process disclosures. This could induce some biases, right? Biases in terms of large and multinational firms towards countries with reporting requirements and towards firms that disclose more things. And this is one of the points that Aneesh made, right? They are also based on inputs and that might not translate into outputs. Inputs meaning policies, programs, as opposed to outputs that would be emissions, violations. Now, but I guess that, you know, to be completely fair here, we should also consider some potential counter arguments. And I'm not taking sides here, just to show the two sides of the coin, right? Focusing on outputs also has limitations, which are the material outputs. Actually, the penalties for violations considered by the paper are pretty small, so are they material? We might need many outputs to get a complete picture of ESG performance. The inputs, right, policies, programs, those things could be more predictive of ESG performance than outputs. Outputs could be focused on compliance, and I think that in ESG performance there is more than compliance. Disclosing ESG voluntarily could signal ESG commitment and future performance. I mean, maybe this disclosure is not a causeless signal. I mean, if you have a good ESG performance, why aren't you disclosing it? I mean, isn't it possible that we can have a separating equilibrium here? What would be the acceptable correlation among proxies of a very complex, multi-dimensional and hard to measure underlying construct like ESG? Well, maybe, you know, 54%, which goes up to almost 70% when it comes to E and S, is actually not that bad if you take into consideration the difficulty of measuring what we are trying to measure. If the ESG ratings are poor quality, why do investors buy them? Okay? And here's an illustration of what you have inside the ESG ratings. I mean, what I would like to highlight here is that you do have the outputs that the authors consider in the paper. I mean, you have their CO2 emissions, you have their penalties for health and safety issues, and you also have many other things. The question is, should we ignore all these other things and just focus on a subset of these things that are inside the ratings? So do the results reflect opportunism? I mean, my takeaway from the empirical test is that what we learned from this, and I think that, you know, this is pretty clear, is that ESG funds follow ESG ratings. Now, is this opportunistic behavior? Well, perhaps it's under investment in monitoring. They follow this because it's just very expensive, you know, to do their own research. If they do their own research, can do it better than the ESG rating agencies. Who is going to internalize this cost? If there is an inefficiency here, because there is definitely a disturbing result, right? Who is to blame? I mean, the funds, the asset management company. Sometimes let's take into account that this ESG research is done at the management company level. The ESG rating companies, maybe they are the ones to blame. Why not the firms for not disclosing high quality ESG information? Why not the governments for not harmonizing and regulating ESG reporting? And we know that, you know, some of them are trying, and it's not being an easy task. Now, the second point I would like to address in this discussion, does the paper inform the debate on how to deal with greenwashing? I guess, you know, at the heart of the debate about greenwashing is the question of whether ESG attracts money. Okay, and Well, I mean, the research on that question, well, for my reading from it is that, at least this is my reading, the bottom line I would say is that it's not clear that ESG pays off. But what is pretty clear in the literature is that it attracts money, right? So one would wonder why. Well, because the literature explains that some people are willing to give up some return for, let's say, a higher good, right? But then you would say, well, this is generating pretty important incentives to greenwash. And actually, perhaps it's not surprising that the literature, and this is explained in the paper, finds evidence consistent with greenwashing among PRI signatories. But I would like to point out or to emphasize that the evidence is focused in the US. And it is not clear that this is going on in the rest of the world. I mean, and especially in Europe. There is also evidence, and we need to take into account that investors are pushing for ESG performance. There are recent published papers that document that investors are having an effect based on ESG ratings, an effect on carbon emissions. There's papers that look at engagements. There is also evidence that ESG funds receive higher sustainability ratings. This is evidence or this data from Morningstar, which is the data source used by the authors. There is also evidence that ESG funds vote for ESG proposals. We're going to see a paper discuss about it in a few minutes. Again, this is data from Morningstar. As you can see there, a substantial percentage of ESG funds always vote for ESG proposals. Say a large majority of them, they vote for ESG proposals more than 50% of the times. And some ESG funds are engaging in costly activism, and activism that is increasingly successful despite having some negative effects on stock prices. Here you have I would say, a famous example by an environmental activist that just got two seats on the board of Exxon, which I think is a big deal. Now, I mean, what should we take out of this? Well, I guess there's evidence that there is greenwashing out there, but I think that there is also evidence suggesting that some funds, some investors are, let's say, doing things consistent with their claims. Maybe more than looking at the extremes, it would be more fruitful to look at what in my mind are some important unresolved issues in the literature. Here you have 4, there could be more. Okay, so is greenwashing sustainable in a repeated game? How hard is it to detect? Do investors see through it? Which investors are more likely to engage in greenwashing? Is there anything we can do about the incentives, the objective function, the incentives to greenwash? What impedes or facilitates greenwashing? What is the magnitude of the problem? I mean, is the problem prevalent enough to justify certain, let's say, costly regulatory actions? Now, what does the paper tell us about these unresolved issues? I think that the paper is telling us some interesting things about this. The paper is telling us that ESG funds within a family follow ESG ratings even at the cost of getting lower returns. I think that this is a very interesting finding. Of course, the interpretation of this finding might depend on what you think about ESG ratings, okay? But I think that just documenting this is definitely something we want to know, especially because prior literature did not find this among PRI signatories. The paper also finds that third-party certification matters, low carbon designation, right? And again, this is important because we just found a mechanism that might help us reduce the risk of greenwashing. But I guess just to finish, I mean, I must also say that when it comes to generalizability, we need to be cautious, okay? So the within family analysis that the paper, the authors do ends up in a relatively small sample of ESG funds and leaves out important variation, okay? So should we expect similar results outside the US? Well, based on my reading of the literature and based on my own research, is not totally clear. So in summary, I would say, in terms of the two points that I addressed in this discussion, I mean, this is my conclusion. Do the results really reflect opportunism? I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the results suggest that there might be an inefficiency here because the ESG ratings are not correlated with some important, let's say, outcomes, at least some compliance outcomes. And we need to better understand this inefficiency. So, I mean, in my mind, this is sort of calling for further research. Does the paper inform the debate on greenwashing? I think so. But again, let me emphasize that the results need to be interpreted with caution. That would be it. I guess I'm on time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Guys, thank you so much for ending on time. And because you did that, and we have a number of good questions coming in, but they're not all totally collinear with Gaizka's points there. So Aneesh, could I offer you to just take 2 minutes to, if you want to make any responses to Gaizka's discussion before we move on to the specific questions?
Yeah, I won't take too long just because I know there's a lot of questions, but I just want to give Gaizka one specific thing that's not, there's no room for it in the paper, but one thing on the last bit on generalizability. Again, this is a very limited piece of evidence, so take it with a grain of salt. But I've actually been involved in the construction of a UK version of the violation tracker, the violation data. And, again, this is not nearly getting towards a full paper, but I can tell you there's also no relation between ESG scores over here and what firms are up to no good over here. Now, again, that doesn't completely inform by any means your points on generalizability, but just something that I thought you might find interesting given kind of where you were just going with the discussion. So with that, I look forward to your slides, Gaizka, but otherwise I'm happy to take questions.
Hey, Matt, do I have 90 seconds?
90 seconds,
okay?
please, yes.
Yeah, okay. So Gaizka, thank you again, as usual, very balanced and constructive. 2 points. One, in this world, what is actual performance? That's why we started looking at this. In the world of fundamental analysis, I can at least tell you what actual performance is. I have no idea what that is. And this is our attempt to at least put some structure on that. 2, scores. I've spent enormous time with all these guys trying to understand what they do. And here is my summary of what I think they do. All they do effectively is run NLPs on thousands of news sources, and they are looking for news hits. Nike uses child labor in Bangladesh hit. Okay, so they'll suck that in and they'll score that as a concern. And all the literature on that topic, if you look for things like stock price reaction, is effectively picking up how salient that news is for the company. So virtually the entire literature here focuses on scores and ratings. I'm a deep skeptic based on what I've discovered after talking to these people and doing some in-depth work. So I'll stop there. There are many things one can discuss, but this is an issue for the whole literature. What is fundamental performance in this world? And 2, let's be a bit cautious about ratings and scores.
All right, thank you. So I'll take 9 minutes for these questions, and I'll try to sort of bucket them together because we have some themes emerging here, but I'm sure I'll distort people's questions a little bit. So we have a couple questions on this one theme here, although I think Frank Zhang from Yale was the first to get at this, so I'll attribute this to him. He asked whether there's a sort of a self-selection issue here in the sense that you might sort of market yourself as a ESG firm that's making ESG efforts if you are just in a line of business or doing activities where there's going to be more ESG related issues inherently to what you are as a firm. So he suggests that one way to get at this, and a number of people raise this issue, he suggests one way to get at this is to examine ESG strengths and weaknesses separately. Under your story, basically, you would expect fewer strengths and more weaknesses. But if it's a matter of Frank's story about the self-selection issue, you'd expect both more strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think maybe the hardest issue here is translating this sort of ESG score paradigm of counting strengths and counting weaknesses into sort of hard observable data that we can actually then measure, right? Because I agree that ideally we'd be looking at not just violations, not just who's up to no good, but also more on who's actively doing good things, right? Now, one issue is that most of these strengths, right? If you look at the underlying scores, most of what they're actually capturing is what Shiva just said, right? It's these, it's largely things like voluntary disclosures, it's things in the sustainability reports, but it's not so much something that we can get hard data on. And we have tried where we can, right? So that's kind of one reason that we put in the emissions tests was that I don't necessarily view emissions as just an obvious weakness, right? Good emissions should be rewarded. And so that's kind of the closest we can directly get to Frank's point in the sense that emissions can be a strength or a weakness depending on where they are. And we do find that emissions disclosure is stronger. That might be another strength. But in terms of trying to actually figure out what these are and then map them into things like hard data, right? Not just voluntary disclosures. I think it's just, it's a little bit empirically easier to observe who's up to no good. And so, I mean, now of course we can ask normative questions about, well, what good things do you have to do to offset the dead worker in the factory? But it's a little bit harder to maybe answer those, I guess.
Great. So we also have a couple of questions just pointing out that basically fund managers don't have infinite degrees of freedom here. They face some institutional constraints and career concerns in terms of stock selection. So a couple of participants asked questions about sort of essentially if the fund managers are constrained by benchmarks, et cetera, how would that sort of affect your results? And one questioner, I'm sorry, it's tough to manage all of these, suggests that perhaps you could just look at sort of the most concentrated portfolio holdings, sort of the top 10 or 20 stocks, because that's more likely to reflect sort of their manager's discretionary choice versus the institutional constraints.
Yeah, so I'll take those in reverse order, just because I think the answer to the first one is shorter. So the answer, in terms of just looking at the top 10 or 20, our approach of kind of constructing a value-weighted portfolio measure, right? So value-weighted portfolio labor performance, value-weighted portfolio environmental performance largely already gets at that. Now, of course, it's not perfect, right? We could maybe literally look at just the top 10 or 5 or whatever. But given that, if you look at the holdings of a lot of these funds, right, you have 10 or 15 firms where the shareholdings are way higher than in everyone else. I have a strong suspicion it just wouldn't really change much, right? Just because our approach is actually very close to that informally. Now, on the other point of benchmarks and could there be institutional benchmarks, I agree that there could be, and I agree that there could be reasons that fund managers are acting in their own best interest personally, right? Like we all respond to economic incentives. But then at the same time, even if they're acting in their best incentives, sure, that could maybe help explain why we find what we find. But at least in my view, it doesn't necessarily sort of make it all okay, right? In the sense that if you have incentives to mislead me, you then go and mislead me. I still have the right to be a little bit, not so happy when I find out, right? Even if it was in your best economic interest, if you were sort of working within the fund and you were constrained by institutional. And then one other sort of minor thing, just on the point of benchmarks, we do actually try to look into this in a little bit more detail. And of course, it's hard to do this perfectly. One thing we do is we actually entry balance within asset manager in year. And we control for things like past performance. We control for things like portfolio holdings in terms of industry, and our results still come through, right? So that's like, there's no perfect way to benchmark. And we'd actually argue that the relevant benchmark is, in labeling yourself an ESG fund, you're saying that the relevant benchmark shouldn't be financial, it should be on these stakeholder specific measures, because that's specifically the standard you're holding yourself to. And so we'd argue that, there may be institutional constraints on the financial performance of an ESG fund, but if so, then, I wouldn't expect to see our results on returns where they're also underperforming financially, right? So if they're basically forced to just mimic non-ESG funds, you should see no difference in financial performance, but we do see that.
Thank you. All right, so just one final question, unfortunately, here. So April Klein from NYU points out that obviously this is a very live and growing issue in the research and also in the institutions involved in this. So she asked, are your findings stable over time? So the interest in ESG and ESG providers and measurement has exploded since 2017. So we might ask, therefore, would we expect these firms still to be engaging in greenwashing even now in later periods?
Yeah, so I mean, I can only speak to our sample years, obviously. I can't speak to the years of data we didn't have. But at least if you look sort of early half of our sample, late half of our sample, if we try to cut it in a couple different ways, it doesn't seem like it's driven by just one or two years. It seems to be largely consistent. Now, of course, if we had 2021 data, we could, who knows, maybe hopefully we'd find something different, but I'm not, given the SEC's concern, I'm not so sure we would. But you don't sort of see this attenuation within our sample period going through 2018. So I hope that kind of answers that.
All right, thank you. And thank you to everyone for staying on time. So we have a number of questions we had to cut off, but those will be sent to the authors of the paper and we can discuss them in the virtual sessions as well. So our next session starts at 10 a.m. and I'll just say 10 a.m. because California is the center of the universe. So I don't need to specify the time zone. So thank you so much, Aneesh, Gaizka. Thank you everyone for your questions and see everyone in 10 minutes at 10 a.m.